Yeah, a lovely subject tonight, and it's a joy to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me. But I do want to. That wasn't meant to happen that way. I do want to make you think tonight. The hymn we've got in front of us, Facing a Task Unfinished, and we're talking about the priority of mission. I want to try to explore what we mean in the day in which we live by mission, and to expand our thinking a little bit, because we're living in very challenging times, and I believe the Lord really wants to speak to us. I'm going to put that over there now. So, just in terms of the task unfinished, what is the scale of the problem? I've just looked up Google today, actually. The world's population, the last figure they give is in April this year, is 7.7 billion people in the world altogether. The average life expectancy at the moment is 72 years. I was surprised it was so high, but anyway, there it is, taking the whole population. And that was a figure from 2016, which means, in a very simple way, that if we want to do the task given to us properly, we, as a minimum, we should have to evangelize 7.7 billion people every 72 years. We're not doing very well. I believe that the proportion, I haven't looked up this figure, of people that claim to be Christian in one form or another, we might disagree with that definition of Christianity, but is somewhere about 1.3 billion. So that's the scale of the problem, which we're saying we haven't even, well, we certainly haven't finished it. We've hardly started. But just before we go right into it, I just want to deal with this question. What about Romans chapter 2, verses 14 to 15, where we read, "Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them." So the question comes up, what about those who have never heard? All those many, many people throughout the last 2,000 years that we've never reached with the gospel. After all, Romans also tells us that everyone must give an account of themselves to God. If we're talking about a task unfinished, then there must be inevitably that question in our minds, what about those we've never reached? And today, many of those that have never been reached, that know nothing about Jesus and nothing about the gospel, live in our own country. The vast housing areas, particularly in cities, we're just not reaching even our own population, let alone the rest of the world. And what about all those before the modern missionary movement? I do look at this, and this may be a little controversial, but I believe that the God of all the earth will do right. And those that have never actually heard the gospel, from these verses, it seems, and I put it no higher than that, but it seems to me anyway, that God will look on how they've dealt with what's been written in their hearts, because every human being has a conscience. Wonderfully, we don't have to understand the theology of redemption in order to be redeemed. So it just seems to me that the Lord, when everyone has to give an account, he will be dealing with them according to the light that they have received, whether the light of conscience in their hearts or whether they've heard the gospel. Now, the question then arises from this passage, well, if this is the case, why do we bother to preach them in the first place? Aren't we putting them more in danger? I would say there's two answers to that question. One is, the Lord has told us to go and preach the gospel anyway. So we're under an obligation to do just that. And we can't use these verses as an excuse not to do it. The other answer I would give is this, that those who have heard the gospel and responded to it are in a wonderful position in their relationship with God through Jesus Christ, in that we are building up the rewards that will come to us in heaven for the faithfulness with which we have served him. So by preaching the gospel and bringing people to faith in Jesus Christ, not just relying on God judging them by the light of conscience, we're giving them the opportunity to build up treasure in heaven. And that is so important, which actually begs the question, are we ourselves using our knowledge of the gospel in order to make sure that we're building up treasure in heaven? You know, we often talk about the blessings of our salvation, but what about the rewards of our salvation? That as we stand before the Lord with his judgment seat, he will reward us for our faithfulness in doing what he's asked us to do as his children. So it's another reason why we're preaching the gospel, is so that people, having entered into a relationship with Jesus here in this life, can then follow him and build up that gold, that silver, those precious stones in their life, where the Lord will be able to say, well done, good and faithful servant. I hope all that makes sense. I've dealt with it very quickly. But what I really want to look at tonight is put this all into a context, mission, from a passage in the Old Testament, putting the priority of mission into a biblical context. I believe we have to look bigger than just preaching the gospel as we're talking about mission. And I'm going to read this passage. I think it's very, very important, not just for Israel, to whom it was initially given, Ezekiel 33 and the first 9 verses, but I think here's a principle that's incumbent upon us right throughout God's dealings with the human race. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, speak to your countrymen and say to them, when I bring the sword against a land, and the people of the land choose one of their men and make him their watchman, and he sees the sword coming against the land and blows the trumpet to warn the people, then if anyone hears the trumpet but does not take warning, and the sword comes and takes his life, his blood will be on his own head. Since he heard the sound of the trumpet but did not take warning, his blood will be on his own head. If he had taken warning, he would have saved himself. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet to warn the people, and the sword comes and takes the life of one of them, that man will be taken away because of his sin, but I will hold the watchman accountable for his blood. Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. So hear the word I speak, and give them warning from me. When I say to the wicked, O wicked man, you will surely die, and you do not speak out to dissuade him from his ways, that wicked man will die for his sin, and I will hold you accountable for his blood. But if you do warn the wicked man to turn from his ways, and he does not do so, he will die for his sin, but you will be saved yourself. I think that's a very powerful passage. And I'm putting that into as the overall context of mission. We are, or we should be, every one of us as Christians, watchmen on the wall. So the watchman's duties, taking this passage as a principle that applies not just to Israel, but to us in the church age, in context of mission, what are our duties? I've put them as twofold here. One is to inform those around us of their responsibilities before their Maker and of his grace. That's the Great Commission. That's the gospel. That is a given for the whole of the gospel age. We have a duty to tell the world that they are facing a lost eternity. They are guilty because of their sin. And before a sin-hating God, they are destined for eternal damnation. That's the warning. If we fail to warn, then God will hold us accountable. I don't think it means we lose our salvation, but as we stand before the Lord, giving an account of our Christian life, he's saying, well, why didn't you tell people what you knew that my Spirit had put on your heart and what the Word has told you? I mean, the worst thing that can happen is when we've been raptured away, people turn around and said, they never told us. They never told us what the answer is and what was happening. We'll go into that a little more in a moment. So the first duty of the watchman on the wall is the Great Commission to go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Evangelism. The second is to inform those around us of what lies ahead. And I do think this is part of mission. God's judgment on sin, a warning. And particularly, and I want to make the case this evening, particularly if we believe we are nearing the last days, and you don't have to listen to a preacher to tell you that, read your newspapers, where so many people wondering what on earth is happening to the world. School kids going on marches saying, what sort of world are we going to have with climate change and so on and so forth? Overpopulation, food supplies, politically and economically. The media are using our words. Apocalyptic, for example. And the world itself is wondering what's happening. Are we saying anything into this? Has the church got anything to say? After all, we got the book. And we know the end. We know the story. So I believe the Watchmen, very much based on this passage, is to inform those around of what lies ahead. Yes, to preach the remedy, the means of escape, but also if for those who do not receive, there is a day of judgment, to put it simply. And I believe that's the Watchman's duty. This is a task unfinished. This is the priority of mission. To put it not just in the simple going out and preaching the gospel, but to look at the enormity, the totality of what God is asking us to do. That's on my heart this evening. Let's look at the present situation then. I am rushing, I know, a little bit, but there's a lot to get through in half an hour. The present situation that we're in at the moment, I hope I haven't overemphasized it, but let's look at it very quickly. Number one, a great period of gospel witness since World War II, including a general acceptance of Christian activities and standards. I'm old enough to remember the tremendous amount of evangelism that went on in the 50s, the 60s, 70s, even Billy Graham at Ashton Gate in the 80s, 84. It seems to me with the passing of Billy Graham last year, it's almost symbolic of an end of an era. Where's the great evangelistic outreach? Sunday schools with hundreds of kids. Youth clubs. We used to take our young people from Enmore, just outside Bridgewater, where I worked for 30 years. We used to take them up to Colston Hall in Bristol every month for Youth for Christ rallies. A place was packed out. And so much going on. All the different evangelists, the counties workers, the village, the caravan mission to village children, I remember. And so much going on all the time. Very little evangelism now. Most churches and chapels would have a measure of gospel preaching in them. So many of them are closed down now. They've gone. There's been a tremendous, this is point number two, winding down of real gospel outreach, and I'm talking about our nation in particular. But I think it's this really applies to the nations, mainly English-speaking, that have had a tremendous gospel presence since the Reformation, with the Great Awakening, with the great reforms of the Victorian times and the movements of God, and earlier this century. Now, I'll stay on number two a minute. The apparent end of the gospel era in those parts of the world where it has been present over the centuries. It's not entirely a black picture, because evangelism seems to be going on very, very prominently in the nations which didn't have the gospel when we had it all. Eastern Europe, particularly the one-time communist countries, China, Japan. I knew a little bit about South America, and some of you follow David Hathaway's ministry. It going on in countries where they haven't had the gospel until in the way we've had. But there seems to be a winding down. It's the same in America as it is in this country at the moment. A real decline. Point number three. Social activity in the churches is seen as much more important. I'm not decrying social activity. I enjoy a cup of coffee and a nice cake along with the rest. But is that all we're known for? And church after church after church does a lot of social activity, which we should be doing anyway. But there's very little preaching, certainly preaching the gospel. There's widespread indifference, point number 4, to the authority of the word. I talk about Bridgewater. It's in a dreadful state in terms of the preaching of the word of God. Thus says the Lord. That is the church's job, whether it's in the gospel or the warning of what God is saying to the world. And we've replaced the centrality of the preaching of the word with social activity and just being another social organization in the community. And then number 5, there's been the onslaught of moral relativism, replacement theology, and liberal doctrine. A church in Bridgewater that once had the pastor's still there, a great evangelical reputation, one of the denominational churches. And gradually you could see a downgrade. And the evangelicals were really up in arms and gradually leaving. Until he said the whole of the first 11 chapters of Genesis are only allegorical. Doesn't believe in a 6-day creation, doesn't believe in a literal flood, worldwide flood, and so on. That same pastor conducted earlier this year a gay marriage in his church, and he was happy to do so. It's the downgrade, the decline that's happening, and we're just picking up the ethos of the world. And the evangelical influence is muted and ridiculed. Very much so. Some places a little bit more holding to the gospel than others, but so many churches now are open to the idea that all roads lead to God, all religions have something to say, and so on and so forth. You don't need me to go into further detail. So in that situation, what is the watchman's position today? What is our duty? First of all, the watchman must listen. The watchman needs to say, the word of the Lord says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. That's 7 times in the book of Revelation to the letters to the churches. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Are we taking that on board? If we're faced with this tremendous challenge, the business that's not finished, the challenge of the day that I've just tried to highlight very briefly, are we listening to what God has to say? Has he got anything to say? Is the prophetic voice coming through today? I don't mean just the preaching, but what God is saying about the last 3 years in our nation with the tremendous chaos and confusion. What's it all about? What's God saying? Are we hearing what God is saying to the churches? The watchmen should be listening. How can we go with a relevant message unless we first spend time listening to God? Very often our prayer times are only us speaking to God instead of us listening to God, because prayer is a two-way conversation. Secondly, the signs of the time all point to the closeness of the rapture and the tribulation judgment thereafter. And I just mentioned this just now, but the signs of the times really put us in a very, very important place in history, where there seems to be almost a rise in godlessness, in man's humanism. Put it this way: if God had to intervene at the Tower of Babel, which was an age of humanism, they were building this to make themselves equal with God, and he said, I'll have to stop them, otherwise they'll think they can do anything. If God had to stop them in that age, how much longer is he going to let us go on today? With genetic engineering, with moral relativism, with gender confusion, and so on and so forth, with the overpopulation of the world, with the whole of the climate in chaos, and so on. How much longer is God going to let it go on? It seems that biblical prophecy about the end days is coming to pass before our very eyes. The Lord said, watch and pray. When you see these things begin to take place, look up, because your redemption is drawing nigh. He also said, blessed is the servant who, when the master returns, is still busy about the master's business. So we're talking to a generation of watchmen who are looking at what God is doing. He's almost at the threshold. And number 3, the watchman recognizes that unless we declare what God is saying, the responsibility for the ignorance all around us will be ours. And that's evangelism and warning. The watchman's job altogether says not only do we point people to Jesus Christ, but we give them a warning of the terrible judgment that God will have on those who refuse to listen. I'm not quite sure whether I should deal with these 3 biblical principles. The ages of history, it seems that I'm going to have to just deal with these very, very quickly. We're in the age of grace, point F there, from Pentecost to the Lord's return. I believe there's a millennial reign. But what I want to just point out is that each of these dispensations finish with a time of judgment. And I will just say this. I've just got a set of notes on the watchman's position. Just help yourself to a sheet. The details are on there. If anyone's interested in my latest book, they're all How King Jesus. There are 11 studies in there about the Lord's return in all the different aspects. It costs £1 each if anyone's interested, but take them if you haven't got anything in readiness. But all these are in detail there. But look, the age of grace, it finishes with what we call the tribulation, which is mentioned in Isaiah 24 and the majority of Revelation for verses 6 to 18. I hold to that belief that the church will be raptured away, and then we have this tribulation period. And the tragedy will be when we're raptured away, people saying they never told what they knew. They knew what God was going to do. They knew that they were going to a better place. Maybe they laughed at us when we did mention it. But are we really telling the world God will have a day of judgment? I don't believe we're in the day of judgment yet. We're still in the day of mercy, of grace. We're still in the day when whosoever will may come. That's the thrill. But we have to warn the world. There is a judgment that's coming. I'm going to go through those 3 biblical principles. Just leave them at that because time is almost gone. But I want to make this statement. And I haven't quoted anybody else. This is my own statement that I put in the notes. But I can't put it any other way. Toward the end of the church age, we may well be in those days, being watchmen inevitably means that the generation of Christians living in the years just prior to these events will be given the clarity of understanding of God's purposes that will enable them to declare those purposes to a world that is just about to experience them. There will be a generation of Christians who will live at that moment when Jesus calls us home, and the world then suddenly finds that Antichrist figure, that lawless one, and the agenda that is set out for us in Revelation in particular. And so there's going to be a generation of Christians alive that God will specifically speak to through the Spirit, saying that urgency, there is a day of judgment, tell the world. And I believe that's happening. We have the internet today. You just think in our lifetime, the last, 20 years, the ability for us to get into people's homes with a message through the internet, unlike any other previous generation in the last 2,000 years. Radio, television, satellite, media of all sorts. Many Christians are making use of this. We've got a fellow in our little fellowship at home, and I'm going to just give you his name, Andy. He took a year's sabbatical. He's a quantity surveyor from July last year just through to September this year. And his vision was, he felt the Lord laid on his heart to put a tract, a leaflet, which I've given you one part of it. In fact, I have got copies here. I'll just get them out and show you a minute. Yes, there they are. There they are. In every home in Bridgewater. That was his vision. He's almost completed it. And that's the front there that I've got on the screen, Signs of the Times. And the inside on the next, no it didn't. Yes, there it is. And the website, and you have to be very careful to put in the full sign there, www signs of the times, XYZ. XYZ is a new domain area, and what a lovely way of saying this is the end, XYZ. But I want to, and if this works, I just want to show you a little bit of his website because I think it's quite incredible. Bear with me while I just go. We did prepare this beforehand, and I hope it's going to work. Yes, there we are. That's the front page of his website, Signs of the Times, and that's the top half of his opening page. Let me go right down, and the bottom. Now, on that opening page, there are 9 blocks there, and each one is an area of interest. So, for example, we have natural disasters, social, war and peace, economic, religion, technology. What's this one here? I'll have to go down a bit. Environment, globalization, and knowledge. And if you click on any one of them, well, let's just do the environment. As you click on any one of them, then a whole thing comes up. That's the climate change, pollution, and other things. So if I just go on to climate change, for each of these areas, those 9 blocks, and each one has these list of subjects, and then he's got up to 1,000 words on every subject. I think there's about 50 subjects altogether, with all the media stuff that he's assembled from all over the world, from the internet and so on. Not our words, but words from the media, from the public, from the world today, showing. And at the end of each of these areas that he can put people, he can invite people to look at, there's, I can just find it, there we are. What does the Bible tell us about this, about the future? And what does this mean for you? And the Bible points out to the references to that particular subject. This one is climate change. What does this mean for you? There's the gospel. Now, when they go out, and 2 or 3 of our fellowship have been out with him to a certain area of the town, so they've gradually covered the town on Saturday mornings, he actually looks at his website because he's got the master site, and he's got one of his counters on there, and so he can see just how many people are looking at it from what they're doing when they're going out with that leaflet through the doors. They don't knock on the doors, they put the leaflet in unless there's somebody in the garden, and that's also, it's not provoking people or so on. And every time they go out, there's a spike in those who look at the website. And he's actually subdivided it. And the one, I'll probably do that, the good news. Yes, and those who actually go right through to the gospel site, there's an even higher spike for that. Now that is reaching thousands and thousands and thousands of people that would never darken the doors of a church. The Watchmen on the wall. Our mission, yes, to tell them about Jesus, that's what he's doing, but to warn them that the world is out of control. But the Bible tells us already that that's going to happen. And we know that. And it's our duty to warn the world as well. Yes, a task unfinished. But I believe we're moving into an age where it's not just preaching the gospel, that is a given for as long as we're here, but also what is the Spirit saying to the churches, our duty today. Thank you for listening. I've rushed through that, but I hope it makes some sense. We'll have a look at that stuff afterwards. Thank you very much. We got a hymn, and it's number 196, I think it is.